Joe and I were having just a very brief conversation before everybody showed up this morning, and we were talking about how um, there is utility in reading sections of the Bible just to get the big picture, and then also having a different mode of study and reading where you're studying to get all the details. Because um, as I've gone through each of these different lessons and had to prepare by kind of searching for the details that a lot of, myself included, miss over the years of having read the story of David or Joshua or Moses, whatever. I'm starting to see that we really need both of those, right? That we need to see the big picture and be able to sit down and maybe in a couple of minutes outline what is the story of David. But then there's so many details. And I was thinking as we were praying, and forgive me, there was a part of my brain that was thinking while I was listening to your opening or your prayer there. And a question I want to ask God when it comes to this whole Mazzaroth, the story of God create or embedded in the stars, I want to ask him why there are more weekends dedicated to certain Mazzaroth signs where the big story and the details are not of the same magnitude as the story of David. Because the story of David is pretty deep. There's so many mini stories within his story, and there's so many details that I'm like, I need like twice the amount of time to get through everything that we probably should know and should cover. So I guess that's maybe my sideways of saying you guys got to go back and make sure you read all of it, right? Because I've only been able to spend maybe 3 or 4 weekends. I think it is 4 weekends, giving you the highlights and trying to pull out some details that, like I said, we all tend to miss as we go through casual reading. So today is our last lesson in Capricorn. So it's the final big picture review of David and the Davidic covenant. And last week, one of the things I talked about in the video was about the differences between Saul and David and why God took the kingdom from Saul, but he didn't take it from David, despite the fact that they both made some major mistakes and in the words of the writers of the Bible, transgressed God's law. Does anyone remember what the distinction is? Like, why did God rip the kingdom from Saul but not from David when they both transgressed the law? Judy.
Because David's were moral and personal, and Saul's were because he was a steward and the king.
Yeah, their failure were kind of in two different arenas, and I think it's important for us to be able to reconcile those things, because if we don't, it makes God look fickle and like he's playing favorites, right? And he's not. He's not. If we understand where the failure was, right? So David's transgression was with Bathsheba, for which he was severely punished by losing 4 of his many sons. We'll talk about his sons coming up in a little bit. And that was a transgression of the moral aspect of the law that every single Jew was bound to follow, right? Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Do not murder. Which, by the way, under the law? What was the standard punishment for what's that?
Death.
Yeah, it was death, right? Stoning, death by stoning. But that's not what God happened. And if you remember when Nathan and David were having the conversation, Nathan showed up and gave him the parable of the rich man who took the poor man's lamb, and David got all bent out of shape and said, "Oh, he's going to repay 4 times what he took." Nathan said, and I forget, I'm not going to quote it specifically, but he said that your sin has been removed. And basically what God was saying through Nathan was, even though the standard punishment for coveting your neighbor's wife and murdering somebody, even though the standard penalty for that is death, I'm going to remove that, but you're going to get a different punishment. And his punishment was that he lost 4 sons, the first one being the baby from Bathsheba that died shortly after he was born. So that was David's transgression, right? It was a failure of the moral law that all Jews were required to follow. Saul's, as Judy said, was failure as the steward of the Lord's inheritance. And it really showed up in 2 different places, right? The first one was the unauthorized sacrifice that he made because he wasn't willing to wait until the final moment for when Samuel was supposed to show up and they were supposed to give entreaty to the Lord to figure out whether he was to go to war and if God was going to give him the victory. But then there was the time where he spared King Agag And instead of killing all the animals, they took the best of the animals. And he kind of lied about it, saying, oh, the people did that. And they did it because they were going to sacrifice them to God. And so he failed really in two different major ways in his role as that steward. I also showed you some of the things that we believe about the young David might not be entirely accurate. Remember that whole section in, I think it was 1 Samuel 17 and 18, where there's a lot of, close to, not quite 40, but like 37, 38 different verses that are in the Hebrew Old Testament that are not in the Septuagint. And I believe that they were added to the Hebrew manuscript later, right? Because the earliest Hebrew scriptures we have are from 1100 AD, but the Septuagint is a few hundred years before Christ, right? Separated by maybe about 1300 years. And what that means is that the story of David and Goliath in the Greek version, the Greek translation, it reads a lot more clearly without these clunky potential contradictions that make it look like Saul had early dementia, right? You know, like forgetting who David was, probably just minutes after he had given him his sword and his armor and said, okay, you have my blessing, go ahead and go fight Goliath. And then we left off last week showing why David's part of the story of God is represented by Capricorn. How many of you guys saw that video that I posted on WhatsApp? Pretty amazing, right? And who is it? I think it was Jeannie pointed out that little kid, that goat up in the tree on the branch as he was eating. That's kind of amazing stuff. And I remember when we did this particular study with Tim years ago, when we did that before he put the book out, he gave us a little bit more information about Engedi, about the geography there, but also about the nature of these mountain goats and kind of a metaphorical parallel, you know, being up on high rocks. And he showed us a couple of places in the Psalms where David makes allusions to characteristics of these mountain goats and being on shore footing with the Lord. And so I'd encourage you to either go back and read that chapter in Tim's book, The Mystery of the Mazzaroth, or, you know, even better yet, go back and listen to the Mazzaroth study, right? Because I think the audio is still on there. Remember that after David had been anointed by Saul, after David went into Saul's court and played the harp for him, after he was given command over certain aspects of the army and he led his men in war, there was a period of several years where Saul was chasing David around the countryside, right? And he was trying to kill him, as if killing David could somehow release Saul from the judgment that God placed on him and maybe allow him to retain the kingdom. But David and his band of men would hide somewhere, then someone who thought that they could benefit from telling Saul where David was would leak the information, and Saul would give chase, but then David would escape. And this happened on several different occasions. And then we see this in 1 Samuel 24, where it says, take note, David is in the wilderness of Engedi, literally means the spring of young goats or kids. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. And that's the connection with Capricorn and David. And this particular episode in David's history was, I think, a pivotal one in all the different mini stories of David, because it was the first of two separate times where David had a very, very real and specific opportunity to kill Saul and assume the throne. Yet he chose not to do so on both occasions. Does anyone remember why? Why did David refuse to kill Saul when he could easily have done so? I'm looking at you because you looked like you were going to say something.
Because he didn't want to touch the Lord's anointed.
Yeah. So in verse 6 he said, and he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed or the Christ of the Lord. You know, ultimately, David considered it the Lord's business as to the timing, the when of when he was going to take Saul from the throne. And David showed incredible patience in waiting for what God had said was rightfully his. And that's another mark of distinction between he and Saul, right? Saul was completely impatient when he did the unauthorized sacrifice. He was unwilling to wait for Samuel. He was given a 7-day period, I think it was. And even though there was still a little bit of time left, granted, it could have been minutes for all we know, but he wasn't willing to wait to the end of the prescribed time when Samuel would show up and they would ask the Lord what his will was. Right? So go to 2 Samuel 7. We're going to go there in a moment. 2 Samuel 7. And while you're flipping pages, I'm going to try to summarize a couple of different stories that I think are of note. But again, there's so many mini stories with David that I think are important and are very neat to read through. We'd just still be doing Capricorn in a few weeks if we went through them all. So here's a quick summary. David ends up living, like after he has these couple of encounters with Saul, right? Saul basically would say, "Oh, my son David, I'm so sorry, I've been chasing you, trying to kill you, and if you promise not to kill me, I won't kill you." And then Saul would go right back trying to kill him again. So David ends up escaping, and he lives with King Achish of Gath, who was one of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines, or the term Philistines, refers to a group of people who, very much kind of like the Jews, they were all tribal. So there was more than one Philistine king, right? The Philistines were not necessarily a united nation. So they would have tribes, and then that tribe would have a king. And so there were different leaders, different princes, different kings of the Philistines. And so David goes to this guy, and he basically enlists in the army. And David becomes, basically he and his mighty men become a raiding army or raiding party for King Achish. And they live in the land that the king gives to David, and they live there for about a year and a half. And all the time the king is sending them off to go attack somebody and take all their land and their people and their animals. And so he was using his military prowess and the mighty men of David to go gain spoils of war for this Philistine king. And at one point, the other leaders of the Philistine tribes decide to go to war against Saul and Israel. And so David and his men, they saddle up to go with him, and we're never really given any reason why David was willing to go to war in the service of a Philistine king against Israel, his own people, and specifically against Saul. We're not given any explanation about that whatsoever. But the problem is, when the Philistine princes and leaders learn that David is tagging along, they complain to this King Achish, whom David was serving, basically saying, "Hey, chances are when we get in the middle of the battle, David's going to turn sides and he's going to start fighting against us with Israel." And so Achish sends David off to fight a different battle somewhere else. And during this war between the Philistines and Saul and Israel, David's best friend Jonathan, Saul's own son, who helped David escape, Jonathan gets killed. And when King Saul hears about it, and not only having lost his son, but losing the war, Saul kills himself. He falls on his sword. Problem is, he doesn't die. So he's lying here in the battlefield with his own sword in his belly, and this Amalekite walks by, and the king Saul calls out to him and says, "Just please finish me off." And the Amalekite does. And he takes Saul's crown, he takes his bracelet, and he brings them to David as proof that Saul the king is dead. And David mourns the death of Saul. He mourns the death of Jonathan, his best friend. And then he kills the Amalekite. Do anybody know why? Because he had the audacity to kill the anointed of the Lord. Even though he's lying on the battlefield and Saul asked for it, David was so enraged that this man killed God's anointed that he punished the Amalekite by killing him. Now, at this point, you would think that David is the de facto king of Israel. And the leaders of the tribe of Judah do take him, and they anoint David as the king of Judah, but only the king of Judah. The rest of the nation, and at this point, David moves to the region of Hebron, which is, if you remember, just a little bit south of Jerusalem. And he spends a total of 7.5 years there as king, and he has a couple of wives and some concubines, and he has some children, 6 children to be exact. And what ends up happening in second, and we're working our way to 2 Samuel 7, so I know you're there, we're going to get there in a second. In 2 Samuel chapter 2, Saul's general Abner takes one of Saul's sons named Ishbosheth, and he makes Ishbosheth 3 times real fast. Yeah, right. He makes him the king of Benjamin. So now we have 2 kings. we have David, the king of Judah, and we have Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, who is the king of Benjamin, and the rest of the nation, other than the tribe of Judah, decides to follow the house of Saul. So if you thought that the divided kingdom happened only after Solomon died and the kingdom split into what we think of as the northern and southern kingdoms, now you know that the kingdom actually had split prior to that, and there were periods where there were two kings. In fact, there was more than one time, if only for a few years. And during those few years, the houses of David and the house of Saul were at war with each other. And it lasted for several years. And you can imagine, because David was at this point God's anointed, his only anointed, do you think you can kind of predict how that turned out for everybody? Right? He had God's favor, right? And during this period of time, the general Abner, who had elevated Saul's son to be the opposing king of Israel, he was gaining tremendous influence over the other tribes of Israel. And he ends up having a falling out with the very son of Saul that he placed as the king of Israel. And it was over the fact that Abner, the general of the army, wanted to take one of Saul's concubines. And so they have this falling out, and Abner says, fine, I'm going to David. I've got the ear of all the tribes of Israel. I'm going to David. And he goes to David and he says, listen, if you'll treat me properly, I'll deliver the entire kingdom to you. Well, again, many stories within many stories. This guy Abner and Saul's son Ishbosheth are both killed, and then David becomes the undisputed king over the entire nation, over all of Israel. Not long after this, David conquers the city of Jebus that happens in chapter 5, obviously becomes known as the city of David, later Jerusalem. David takes the ark, he puts it into a tabernacle that's outside the city of David, and David then rules in Jerusalem for another 33 years. So he's in Hebron for 7.5, he's in Jerusalem for 33. So David's reign was 40 years as the steward of the inheritance of the Lord. And he took more wives, more concubines. Once he got into Jerusalem, he had a lot more children, obviously including Solomon and Nathan. And that's obviously where the story of Bathsheba happens. Go to now, if you're not there yet, 2 Samuel chapter 7, because it's during this period of time that the whole idea of building the first temple comes up. 2 Samuel 7, now it came to pass when the king was dwelling in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies all around, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar. And this is the one that the king of Tyre helped him build. But the ark of God dwells inside tent curtains. Then Nathan said to the king, go do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. So just a side question here. Do you think Nathan is speaking for the Lord in this moment? I mean, after all, he was a prophet, right? Go and do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you.
Might have jumped the gun.
Yeah, I think it was probably a reasonable assumption, right? Because God had been with David all along. He had given him rest. He had given him victory over all of his enemies. I don't think there's a single record of David's defeat in any of these historical records. But verse 4, but it happened that night that the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, go tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build a house for me to dwell in? So Nathan was not speaking for the Lord, but he was just making an assumption. Like, apparently everything you do has got God's blessing, so go ahead. If you want to build a house for God, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't, because apparently God hadn't spoken to him at this point. But he does, and he says again, would you say to David, would you build a house for me to dwell in? For I have not dwelt in a house since the time that I brought the children of Israel up from Egypt, even to this day, but have moved about in a tent and in a tabernacle. Wherever I have moved about with all the children of Israel, have I ever spoken a word to anyone from the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the sheepfold, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people, over Israel. And I've been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and have made you a great name, like the name of the great men who are on the earth. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own and move no more, nor shall the sons of wickedness oppress them any more as previously. Since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused you to rest from all your enemies. Also, the Lord tells you that he will make you a house. Now look at verse 10 there, and just read it and see if you notice anything funky or unusual about that particular verse.
That he's giving you a location.
Is he doing it in that moment? Because you're right, you're on the right track.
It says appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them.
Does it say I am appointing or I will appoint?
Future tense.
It's future tense, right? God says he will appoint a place for his children, which we obviously, from our perspective, know is the very city where David and the people are already dwelling. So if they're already there, why does God use the future tense and not the past tense? Because they're already there. Why didn't he say, I have appointed a place for my people? Where's the ark and the tabernacle at this point? Inside or outside the city?
Outside.
It's outside the city, right? David had set up a tabernacle outside the city and put the ark in there. You know, the early city of David, and I don't mean early in terms of when it was founded, but when it came under the control of David and the Jewish people, until God gave instructions to say, build the tabernacle and the temple here, Jerusalem was just one of those temporary places where the ark and the tabernacle would reside. Because at this point, most of the history of the Jewish people was when the presence of the Lord came up from the ark and the tabernacle, they would move, and when it stopped, they would set up. Anybody know where the tabernacle and where the, or not the tabernacle, well, actually it's kind of hard to distinguish them, but there was a period of time where the ark had been captured by the Philistines. And it was under their control for, you know, I'll show you a map and just we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the bottom line is this, is that the event that made Jerusalem the permanent home of the Jews was when God said, okay, build the tabernacle here. Until that point, all the Jews, for all they knew, Jebus or Jerusalem or the city of David was just another place along whatever stop they were going to have. Because God had yet to name the permanent place where he would dwell. And it had nothing to do with the fact that they already lived there, right? It was when God designated, not where they were like, you know, we're tired of moving around. I think we'll just set the ark over here inside the city and we'll just call this home, right? It didn't work that way. What about this? When God said, I will make you a house. Now, David at this point was living in a pretty expensive place. The king of Tyre, who was a friend of David, and Tyre is up, if you're looking at me and I'm the map of the Middle East and the Mediterranean Sea is over here, there's Tyre and Sidon a little bit north. Jerusalem's down here, and you've got Tyre and Sidon up on the coast, right? So the king of Tyre was a friend of David's, and when he decided to live in the city of David and build his house, the king of Tyre gave him all the supplies that he needed for that. So when God said to David, I'm going to build you a house, was he saying like, yeah, that house from the dude up in Tyre is okay, but you know, I can do better. I'm going to build you a better house. Was he saying that that house was not good enough? What was he talking about there? Was it with like being like George and Wheezy? I'm moving on up. How many ways can you use the word house? Obviously, the literal way, which is the abode, the place where you live. How else can the word house be used?
A royal dynasty.
A dynasty, right? And that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about not building David a place to dwell. He had already taken care of that. He was talking about the house of David in the sense of his descendants, and more specifically the line of kings that would come from David, that would be descended, that ultimately would bring us to the Messiah. Verse 12, When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body. And this, we've seen this verse before, right? This is where we see in the Greek version, it uses a word that is generally translated as womb, right? So we've talked about how the Christ came from the seed of a woman and the womb of David. And it's like, that's kind of like, doesn't make sense from a literal standpoint, right? So it's I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your womb, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house, your dynasty, and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. Then David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that you have brought me this far? And he goes into this beautiful prayer that I'd like you guys to go back, if you want to mark this, and go back and just read it on your own time in the next week. It's just this beautiful prayer of humility and praise and appreciation. And this, of course, what we've just read through is what is called the Davidic covenant. Right? And this is the point in the story of David that we've really been working towards here. 5 chapters later, Solomon is born. But I want to ask this question. What are the elements of the Davidic covenant? I showed you a couple of weeks ago how the Davidic covenant kind of fits up underneath and is a subcomponent of the Mosaic covenant, which is a subcomponent of the Abrahamic covenant, which is a subcomponent of the inheritance covenant, right? They're all kind of part of each other. So what are the elements? If you look at these verses, what are the elements of the Davidic covenant?
It's his throne is going to be established. So,
For what time period?
well, we knew it was future, did he? I'm not sure if he did.
Well, I mean, what time period? Like, I'm going to give you the throne for 15, 20 years? Or
Forever.
Forever, right? And Tim has shown us in the past where, neither Greek nor Hebrew really have a word for forever, but they use phrases like ages of the ages. And it means an undefined period of time, which could continue on and on and on and on and on. So, what's that? Olam, olam in Hebrew, right. So David's throne would be established forever. Did God put any conditions on David in this covenant? Did he put any conditions on David?
No, on his son.
Yeah, on his son, right? So in terms of the Davidic covenant and David himself, it seemed to be a perpetual arrangement, and David didn't have to do anything other than maybe have a son.
It was unconditional.
It was unconditional as it related to David. As it related to David, right? Yeah. Did he put any conditions on David's descendants?
To chasten them if they committed iniquity.
Yeah. He said in verse 14, he said, I will be his father and he shall be my son. This is, first of all, it's a statement of the kind of relationship that God wanted with the kings of Israel. He wanted a father-son relationship, which I think is a way of saying, I will teach them, I will guide them, I will train them in my ways. And then he puts the condition, if he commits iniquity, right? Because make a statement like that, if he commits iniquity, you have to go, okay, well, what is iniquity and what's the standard against which I'm being measured? And we've said so many times that God has never dealt with his people in oblique and ill-defined ways. He's always been crystal clear. Here are the rules. Do this, this, and this, enjoy the blessings. But if you do this, this, and this, then there's a curse that comes along with it. And he's always true to his word, right? If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him. Actually, in the Septuagint, it says, I will embarrass him. I will embarrass him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. And this is the same condition that God has always set before the people of Israel when it came to occupying the land, right? When Moses in Deuteronomy spoke to the people, even when Joshua set them and said, okay, we're going to divide the land and let you go back and live in your own tribal areas, they went through the same stuff, like follow the law of Moses, and if you don't, God's going to bring trouble upon you. And so through the period of Judges, the reason why Israel needed the judges was because they wouldn't follow the law, and God would give them over to their neighbors, to the pagan nations. And then a judge would have to rise up and unite the people, and with the blessing of God, they would throw off whatever oppression they were feeling, and they would have a period of time where things were at peace, and then they would misbehave, they would transgress the law, and it would just happen again. And so this is the same set of conditions, but now it's being applied to individual people, right? Or an individual person. Verse 15, but my mercy shall not depart from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Did God have mercy on Saul when he failed as steward of the inheritance of the Lord? He didn't, right? There was no mercy. That's it, you're done. I told you what was expected. And I think he was that cut, and God was that cut and dried with it because of what was at stake, and because of the impact on God's legacy and his reputation, right? It's one thing to have, a regular Jewish person transgress a moral law. It's another thing to have the steward of the inheritance acting in a way that was unbecoming of the commander of the inheritance of the Lord. So if God was unmerciful when it came to punishing Saul, why would he say here that he was going to have mercy on ultimately Solomon? He says, my mercy shall not depart from him. In the context here, he's talking about David's son. Why would he have mercy on Solomon when he didn't have it on Saul?
Well, I think the one comes from a repentant heart. Saul didn't really have a repentant heart, did he? But David did.
So are you saying that God's mercy on Solomon was because of his father David?
Because of his faithfulness.
Yeah, I think it's because of he had a repentant heart.
David did, or Solomon?
They both did for their sins. There was a point in time where Solomon did obviously not walk right with God.
Yeah.
But apparently he came back. David clearly showed a repentant heart. I mean, God said he was a man after my own heart. And I didn't see that in Saul, unless I missed it somewhere. And I think
no, it didn't.
And that's a big difference there, because for anybody to receive God's mercy, his grace, usually there's a repentance in there. Just like salvation, there's no salvation separate from repentance. So there has to be repentance. In order for that God's grace and his mercy to be bestowed on that person, there's a condition applied to that, and that's consistent all the way through Scripture.
Right. It's very interesting to look at these three men and to look at how and why God treated them in different ways, right? We've already pointed out the difference between Saul's failure and David's failure, right? Failure as the steward of the inheritance, failure on a personal moral transgression. Saul kind of had a little bit of both. I'm sorry, not Saul, Solomon. But ultimately, and we're told this later when we get to the part of the story where God decides to take the kingdom away from Solomon, he says, but I'm not going to actually take it away from you. I'm going to take it away from your son. And he says, because of your father David. Right? So the mercy, when in this particular section where we're reading in verse 15, where it says, my mercy shall not depart from him as I took it from Saul. Ultimately, God's mercy on Solomon was based on David and not necessarily Solomon himself. I keep saying Saul when I should say Solomon, but hopefully you guys are following me, right? It wasn't anything that was inherent or lovely about Solomon, because Solomon had a very long history of not following the commands of the Lord. But it was ultimately because of God's love of David and David's diligence and loyalty that he had mercy on David's son Solomon. There are a couple of other components here as well. And the first is that in this section where we see the introduction of the Davidic covenant, the language here allows for the possibility that Solomon himself could have fulfilled the Davidic covenant. Could have fulfilled it, right? And in fact, every descendant of David who sat on the throne could have been the one, but every single one of them failed. And I feel comfortable saying that because Solomon himself said so. Go to 1 Kings chapter 8. This is later in Solomon's career, if you will, about 20 years in, actually. This is part of Solomon's prayer when he dedicated the first temple to the Lord after it was completed. 1 Kings 8:25. He says, therefore, Lord God of Israel, right? So they built the temple, they've consecrated it, or they're getting ready to. Solomon is praying this massive prayer out in public. They're getting ready to go through the ceremony of the dedication. He says, therefore, Lord God of Israel, now keep what you promised your servant David my father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man sit before me on the throne of Israel, only if your sons take heed to their way, that they walk before me as you have walked before me. Notice the plural. Sons. Now, this is probably an unfamiliar concept to most Christians because, and this is the way that I was taught, that verse in 2 Samuel was a prophecy that applied to Christ. And the idea that Solomon or any of the sons of David who sat on the throne over the many generations could have fulfilled the Davidic covenant, this was kind of a foreign idea to me, and I fought it for a while. But Solomon is saying specifically here that there's going to be a line of kings, the sons. He uses sons plural, they plural. And ultimately, we know that the verse applies to Christ, right? Paul does this, and you don't have to go there, but if you want to make a note, Hebrews 1:5. This is in the introduction to Hebrews where Paul is talking about how great Christ is. He's above the angels and all this kind of stuff. And he says, for to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? So he quotes Psalm 2. And then he quotes these verses here in 1 Kings. And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Right? So we know ultimately the son that was referred to in the Davidic covenant ultimately was Christ, but it was possible that Solomon or any of the kings that came successively after him could have been the one who kept the law and acted perfectly as the steward of the inheritance. He could have been the one that fulfilled the Davidic covenant.
But
Joe, is that new to you?
No, not completely, and yet I think it's clearer now the way you're describing it.
Yeah, Walt.
except that none of those men were without sin. And for them to have fulfilled the Davidic covenant, because ultimately man needed that sacrifice. They needed the Christ, the sacrifice of life for their benefit, so that our sins would be taken away. They needed a blemish-free lamb, and that has been the continual teaching from Genesis on forward. So could they really have fulfilled that? They would have had to be perfectly sinless.
They would have. And this is where we start getting into the tension of the nature of Christ, right? Hypostatic union, fully man, fully God. He didn't sin because he was fully God. Well, no, that's not a biblical teaching.
It's a choice.
That's right. So, I know for me that I was taught that Jesus is the only one who could have fulfilled the law because of this dual nature hypothesis.
Well, I'm not saying because of dual nature hypothesis is that person would have had to have been sin-free. Not
Yes.
because of his position of deity, but because he chose not to sin.
The way that Christ chose not to
The
sin.
way that Christ chose not to sin.
Right. So I think when you come to grips with the fact that Jesus gave up his divine qualities and essence to become fully humankind, like Jesus didn't have any human qualities or any additional capabilities that Solomon didn't have. They were identical in that respect. But what Jesus had that Solomon didn't have was the closeness with the Father that Solomon lost the moment he took pagan wives and concubines and started to play the harlot with them. That's where he failed. Had he not done that, could he have been the one? He could have been. Same thing with every other king descended from David that sat on the throne. Through their choices, they could have been the one.
No one was able to keep
Until
the law.
Jehoiakim.
But no one could do it. Not because they weren't fully God and fully human. like most Christians believe. The difference was how close Christ walked with the Father from the moment of his birth, right? What does it say in Isaiah? I think it's Isaiah. Before he knew to choose, he would always choose the good, right? But it was the closeness, it was the presence of the Father with him. And that was that relationship that in the Davidic covenant, when he says, I will be a father to him and he will be my son, he's talking about being there to train him up in the ways that he should go, to help him make the choices when he was confronted with sinning or not sinning. So, ultimately the son that God referred to in the Davidic covenant when he spoke those words to David was the Father's own son. And in a very time travel, moving, mind-bending sort of the way, God was speaking about himself, because who spoke the words of the Davidic covenant to David? The pre-incarnate Christ. He was talking about himself the whole time. It kind of blows my mind, right? I can't wrap my head around that in some ways. Now actually stay there for a second. I don't think I have a reference for you. But David's time on the throne, between David and Solomon, as David was coming into his kingship, there was that period of about 3.5 years where there were two kings, right? There was the son of Saul, Ishbosheth. Say that again, Ishbosheth.
No.
I said it right. I didn't mess it up. So period of 3.5 years. There were actually two other challengers to the throne of David while David was still alive. Right? During David's reign in Hebron, I'm just kind of paint the bigger picture, right? David had 8 wives and concubines total. He had 7 wives in Hebron. And he had 1 wife that he took in Jerusalem, and that was Bathsheba. Micah was one of the 7 in Hebron, and he had 6 children from those 7 wives. Micah, the son of Saul that David married, never gave him a child. Never gave him a child. And then in Jerusalem, of course, he married Bathsheba, and she gave him 4 different children after Uriah was killed and the first baby died.
Did you say Michael, the son of Saul?
Micah. Did I say the son of
Yes.
Saul? Sorry. Micah, the
Might
daughter
wanna
of Saul.
fix that one.
Well, apparently last week I said that David was a God after man's own heart. So Walter was very kind to point that out to me.
That was a good chuckle.
Yeah, so the problem is my brain and my mouth are working at 2 different speeds. So David had a total of 8 wives. He had a total of 19 plus sons. And I say plus sons because he had 2 sons that died that are unnamed in the Bible, right? The first one was that child from Bathsheba that died. And Bathsheba gave David, as I mentioned just a second ago, 4 different children in Jerusalem that would include Solomon and Nathan. And those are the 2 children that give us the 2 different lines that led to Joseph and Mary, right? So Christ's mother and his adopted father were both descended from David directly. 2 of the 19 sons challenged David for the throne. Early on in David's reign in Hebron, his son Absalom killed his older half-brother Ammon, because and Ammon was David's firstborn, and he killed Ammon because Ammon raped Absalom's full sister, right? So Ammon fell in love with Tamar. They were half-brothers and sisters, and Ammon raped Tamar and defiled her, and so Absalom ended up killing him. And this Tamar is the only daughter of David that's mentioned in the Bible. So he could have had 40 kids for all we know, including females. And then there was later in David's reign Adonijah. When David was older and his health was failing, Adonijah proclaimed himself to be king. And the general at the time was a man named Joab, who had been a pretty faithful, but kind of, you read through the stories, you're kind of like, something's not quite right with this dude, because he did some things that David told him not to do, but he kind of did it on the sly. But when Adonijah proclaimed himself to be king, as David was getting old and he was frail, Joab, the general of the army, and Abiathar, who was the high priest, sided with him, probably because at that time he was the eldest son. But Nathan, the prophet, Zadok, another priest, and a man named Benaiah, and all of the mighty men of David didn't side with Adonijah. Can anyone tell me why they think that was? Because now what we're seeing is we're kind of seeing another split, right?
Coup.
Yeah, really, it's kind of what it was.
Because David's the one that has to decide to release himself as king to appoint somebody else as a king.
Or, generally, in a circumstance like that, the king dies, the eldest son becomes the king.
But David was still alive.
David was still alive,
king.
right? So what ends up happening in this story is that the prophet Nathan and Bathsheba worked together to advise the king of what Adonijah was doing, because apparently he had anointed himself as king without David's permission, for sure, and apparently without his knowledge. And what ended up happening was that David, once he learned what Adonijah had done, he had Solomon crowned king. He had him placed on his own donkey and paraded through the streets and had him anointed down at, I'm blanking. What's the well that's down below Jerusalem? You guys all know it.
Jacob's.
No, not Jacob's well. I can't think of it.
Gihon's.
Yeah, the Gihon Springs, right down. He had him anointed down in Gihon. And this was unusual because David had Solomon crowned king while he himself was alive. And in fact, if you read in the account, David is like, go ahead and anoint Solomon king. And he's talking about how he's seeing it with his own eyes, which implies to me that it was unusual for a king to actually see his successor take the throne. Well, Solomon has Adonijah executed after he gave him warning to remember his place. And, not long after he did that, he executed Joab the general and Abiathar the high priest, who were basically traitors, and he replaced them with this man Benaiah and Zadok the high priest. Anybody remember the name Zadok from one of the lessons we did not long ago? I think it was when we did, was it Hanukkah? When I showed you in, I think it's in Ezekiel, I showed you the picture of how the promised land is going to be divided up with the tribes, and smack dab in the middle, you're going to see David's piece. And then in David's land, there's the land that's dedicated to the temple, and then the priesthood, and Zadok, the descendants of Zadok, are going to be the ones who are taking care of the temple. Well, Zadok lived during the reign of David. He was faithful, and he was loyal to David. And when Adonijah proclaimed himself king, Zadok said, no way. First of all, the king's still alive. But I think there's another reason why, right? So let me ask you, why didn't Nathan and Zadok and the mighty men side with Adonijah, who was the eldest son? Why didn't they say, okay, great, you're going to be king. It's fine, David's sick, he's going to be gone soon. You're king, you've anointed yourself, we'll agree with that. Why didn't they do that?
It wasn't right.
Why not?
Because David's still alive. He's the king.
Ignore that part. Give me a better reason. Give me a better reason.
Solomon, because of Davidic covenant.
Did David say at any point, Solomon is going to be my successor?
God said.
Where did God say it?
In the Davidic covenant.
In the Davidic covenant. Okay, go to 1 Chronicles 22.
It's like trying to impeach somebody when they haven't done anything worth impeaching.
Yeah. And the reality is according to David's own words, and you only see this detail in 1 Chronicles 22, it was God himself who named Solomon king even before he was born. Before he was born, Solomon was named king. 1 Chronicles 22:5. Now David is recounting the words that God had spoken to him before. He says, now David said, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, famous, and glorious throughout all countries. I will now make preparations for it. So David made abundant preparations before his death. Then he called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, my son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, you have shed much blood and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. In fact, the name Solomon means peace. He was also called what?
Jedediah.
Jedediah, right? Another name for Solomon. He shall be a man of peace, and I will give him rest from all his enemies all around. His name shall be Solomon, for I will give peace and quietness to Israel in his days. So God named Solomon the successor to David before he was born. He shall build a house for my name, and he shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. Now, my son, may the Lord be with you, and may you prosper, and build the house of the Lord your God, as he has said to you. Only may the Lord give you wisdom and understanding, and give you charge concerning Israel, that you may keep the law of the Lord your God. Now just hang with me for a sec, because we're almost done, and I need to close this story out so we can begin Aquarius next time. So this accounting of the story in First Chronicles gives us some details that we don't see in the earlier version that we read just a moment ago, right? That God named Solomon before he was born. He said he was going to be the king. Doubtless, David would have let that be known, right? In fact, Bathsheba knew, because when they heard that Adonijah had anointed himself king, Nathan goes to Bathsheba and says, this is not good. Go talk to David. And Bathsheba goes in and says, my Lord, hadn't you already said that Solomon would be king? So she knew. Chances are Nathan knew. Chances are the mighty men knew. Chances are that Zadok and Joab and the other traitors probably knew that Solomon was supposed to be king, and God said it. Does it make sense why eventually Solomon executed all the traitors? Because they weren't betraying David. Well, they were, but who were they betraying ultimately? God himself. God himself. Now, that account that we just read there, why wasn't David allowed to build the temple?
Because he was a man of violence. He was a warrior. And God wanted a man that was not a warrior.
Did David make a mistake?
Murder.
So did God say to David, you can't build my temple because you murdered Uriah?
No, he wanted a man of peace to build the temple.
Yeah, and I think I've heard this taught before, that the reason why God wouldn't let David build a temple was because of the murder, but that's not why. He was punished for that already, right?
Right.
Is that you, Caleb?
That was Jennifer.
Oh, that was Jennifer?
That
It was putting me to sleep. A little lullaby. Yeah, so it had not, listen, God had already punished David. He took away 4 of his sons. Taking away the opportunity to build the temple had nothing to do with Bathsheba and Uriah and the murder. In fact, go back and read the verse again. It says, you have shed much blood and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. Is that a single event, or is that a lifetime of, as what Walter said, violence? So here's the question. Was this a condemnation of David? Was it a punishment that he wasn't allowed to build the temple?
I don't think so.
And why would you say that? And I agree with you. Why would you say it?
I don't view it as a punishment, as just God's desire for his temple to be made with peace, not with war. Christ himself is a man of peace, Prince of Peace. And yet, yes, he's going to come and destroy everything that he has to destroy.
A little bit.
But yet, the heart, I guess, of Solomon was different than the heart of David. David was a warrior. That's
why was David a warrior?
He started out as a shepherd boy and killed Goliath.
But why was David a warrior throughout his entire life?
Because all the wars that came against Israel.
God told him to.
Because God told him to.
Yeah.
God, like part of his role as the steward in the inheritance and as the king of Israel was to cleanse the land of the wickedness.
To prepare for his son Solomon in the future.
Right. So think about this, like as a parent, would you ever tell your kid, do this, and as soon as they do it, slap them upside the head and go, what'd you do that for? right? That we look at that and go, okay, well, that's bad parenting, right? You don't tell someone to do something and then punish them for doing what you told them to do. God told David to go to war. He told them to cleanse the land of nations and cultures and traditions where they were sacrificing children to pagan gods, to
Just like he told
demons.
Joshua, same thing.
Right. The problem wasn't the fact that David was a man of war. It's the fact that he was a man of war. And God said, a man of peace is going to build my house. It wasn't a condemnation. It wasn't judgment. It wasn't anything. It was just like conditions. You have fulfilled your role. Now your son Solomon has a different role. And I know you want to build me a house, but you can't because you served me in a different way. And now I need your son Solomon, a man of peace, a man who doesn't have blood on his hands. Now, Solomon had people killed. He had Adonijah and Joab and Abiathar all executed. But justifiably so because they were traitors to God.
Right.
He didn't have innocent blood on his hands. Yeah.
Had David not fulfilled God's wishes of cleansing Israel and the land, Solomon would not have had a peaceful land to live in.
I don't think that God would have uttered the Davidic covenant. Because I think the reason why, and forgive me, Lord, if I speak out of turn, but I think one of the reasons why God spoke the Davidic covenant to him was because it seems to me that David was perfect in executing his role as the steward of the inheritance. He did everything that God said. In fact, if you go back and read the accounts of the stories of when he was young and coming up under Saul, it's said in several different places how David behaved and how he comported himself when he was doing his business. And he was blameless. He was blameless. And I think that that's what led God to say, I'm going to do this. Like, it's going to be from your womb, a descendant of your lineage that's going to sit on the throne forever. No conditions, because you have already proven yourself to be the kind of steward that I am looking for.
You don't look at that any differently than we look at our children.
Right.
We want our children to have things better, more peaceful, a better life, and David would have been that way.
Yeah, and we're kind of willing to do things that we don't want our kids to do, to give them a better life and more opportunity and all that kind of stuff, for sure. Go to 1 Kings chapter 3. I want to take a look at a couple of times where God appears to Solomon, and then we'll bring this to a close and we'll have our Margaret party without Margaret. 1 Kings 3. This is obviously now when Solomon is the king. It says, now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places, because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was a great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. So on the screen here on the map, you can see these. I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are all the different places where the Ark of the Covenant was held. First of all, it was up here in Shiloh. Then it came down a little further to Beth Shemesh. But in this story here where it says that Saul went to Gibeon, do you remember in the story of Joshua? Remember the story where the Gibeonites were the ones who put on old clothes and took moldy bread and kind of traveled an hour and a half and told David that Joshua, we've come from such a long way to make a peace treaty. And they kind of deceived Joshua into creating a peace covenant. And then Joshua said, well, we swore that we would not attack them, so we can't attack them. That was the Gibeonites, right? So Gibeon here's Jerusalem. Gibeon is kind of up around here somewhere. And it's only really maybe 9 or 10 miles away from Jerusalem. It's not all that far. So he goes to Gibeon, which apparently was a center for pagan worship, because it says Gibeon, there was a great high place. Anybody familiar with that term, the high place or the high places? Where did we first encounter that?
High place.
Yeah, the term and the phrase, the high place.
I might take a wild guess, but maybe Mount Sinai. I don't know.
Well, a little bit later, but not long, right? Through Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all that kind of stuff, where God was talking about when you go into the promised land, here's what you're going to do. You're going to wipe out all the wicked, evil people, and you're going to tear down their high places, because that's where all the pagans used to worship their gods, right? So here's my question. Was it okay that Solomon went to Gibeon, to the high place, to offer burnt offerings on the altar?
That would be wrong. Because if they're pagan gods, they're offering the high. Who's he sacrificing to? Who's he light incense to? That becomes the question. Is at that point, who is he doing this for?
Good question. Here's another question. Before the tabernacle, where did Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob perform their sacrifices?
Was it Bethel?
They did them everywhere. Sometimes they would just stop and build an altar. Sometimes it was stone. Sometimes it was just a mound of dirt. Right? They didn't have a tabernacle at that point. They sacrificed to God whenever the opportunity came, when it was appropriate. They would stop and build an altar, and they would have a sacrifice. And sometimes it was up on a high place. Think about Abraham and Isaac. When he was, willing to kill his own son, he brought him up on top of a high place. Now later we know that became where the temple actually was built. After Joshua divided the land and the tribes went their separate ways, Joshua placed the ark in Shiloh. It was there for somewhere about 370 years before it was captured by the Philistines. What ended up happening was later the Jews went to war, and so they took the ark with them down to Beth Shemesh to fight against the Philistines. They were like, well, if we take the ark, we're guaranteed victory. Well, they lost. And then the Philistines took the ark and went over to the coast. And then that didn't turn out too well for them, because God sent a plague. And they were like, okay, we got to send this back. This didn't work out the way that we wanted to. Flags 3, 4, and 5 are where the ark resided when the Philistines had possession of it. Flags 1, 2, 6, 7, and 8, and 8 ultimately being in Jerusalem, is where the ark was under the control of the Jews. And then flag number 7 right here is where there was a town called Kiriath Jearim, where the ark lived for 20 years before David brought it to Jerusalem. But when Solomon went to Gibeon, somewhere up around here, again, not very far, to offer sacrifices on the high place, the ark was just outside the city walls. Why did he go there? Was it okay? Well, listen, Samuel gave sacrifices in the high places. If you go back, make a note if you want to go read it. But in 1 Samuel 9, when we looked at the story of when Saul and Samuel first met, because remember, Saul, his dad sent him to go find the missing donkeys, and he encountered Samuel, and God had already told Samuel, just hang out, I'll let you know who the king's going to be. And when Saul came up looking for his donkey, or his donkeys, his father's donkeys, God whispered in Samuel's ear and says, that's him. That's going to be the king. Anoint him. Well, Samuel said to Saul, well, hang out with me. Come up to the high place and we will dine together. So they sacrificed, they ate a meal, and then Samuel anointed him as king. In 2 Chronicles 33, the story of the wicked king Manasseh, after he repented, says this in verse 16, Manasseh also repaired the altar of the Lord, sacrificed peace offerings and thank offerings on it, and commanded Judah to serve the Lord God of Israel. Nevertheless, the people still sacrificed on the high places, but only to the Lord their God. Now, there's no direct commentary anywhere that I can find in the scripture itself that says that God didn't like or didn't authorize sacrificing to him in the high places. There are kind of some oblique statements that made it seem like God would have preferred had they not done that, because we were told before they were supposed to go into the land and tear down the high places. So the question then, I guess, becomes, is God, if you, in these old stories, if someone like Solomon took advantage of an altar on a high place that was used by pagans to sacrifice to demons, and he sacrificed to God on those altars, does God hate that?
Absolutely, it's an abomination.
Probably, but there's, what boggles my mind is there's no direct statement. Like in this introduction in 1 Kings, the first, or chapter 3, these first 3 verses, there's no commentary like, oh, he shouldn't have done that. It just says he offered thousands of sacrifices. And then God shows up and blesses him. So, 1 Kings 3, verse 5. At Gibeon, where he was sacrificing in the high place. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night and said, ask, what shall I give you? And Solomon said, you have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I don't know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? And the speech pleased the Lord. Well, I don't see anything in there where God said, dude, like, you missed it. I was going to bless you and give you the kingdom, but you're sitting on a high place sacrificing. Yeah, sure, it's to me, but I don't know. I'm just like, personally, kind of confused. Go ahead.
Well, let's look further down the road of history when Antiochus Epiphanes defiled the temple and the altar and sacrificed a pig on it. The Jews went in there and cleansed the temple before they could sacrifice.
Yeah.
Now, granted, we don't see anywhere where they're told to do that, where he does that. So we don't know. And like I understand the confusion on that. And I would be
right, and maybe the altars in the high places were cleansed prior to being used for Yahweh. We don't know.
You would think if they did it later, still under the old covenant, of course, and they had to cleanse the temple, why wouldn't they had to cleanse the temple earlier as well?
Well, this isn't a temple, right? These are high places and altars.
High place, it was an altar of sorts used to sacrifice. If they were sacrificing to demons, both situations are the same in that regard. You would think, based on later events, that they had to do it in past events.
You would think.
It's just not, they're just silent about it. There's no clear, definitive statement saying they did this, they did that first, and then they could sacrifice.
Yeah. I think the best position I've come away with is God would have preferred had they not done that, but it didn't seem to be such a sticking point that he was going to punish Solomon for doing it.
Right.
Because he was in Gibeon sacrificing, and it makes a comment. He's done this. He's like thousands of sacrifices, and then God shows up at Gibeon and says, ask of me, what do you want?
Are there references in the Bible that around this era that show that they offered sacrifices at the ark?
Oh, at the like in the tabernacle, you mean?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because the tabernacle would have had the altar as well, right? So
does it reference that? Does the Bible reference that and say specifically that Solomon offered sacrifices at the tent of the ark?
Yeah, so I mean, we read a portion of Solomon's prayer where he was consecrating and dedicating the temple. So the entire time that the tabernacle was outside the city before the tabernacle was built, they would have still been observing Passover and Pentecost and Day of Atonement, right? And they had the system of daily sacrifices. So when they built the temple, they just took what they were doing in the tabernacle outside the city and brought it inside the temple.
Okay, so it says specifically then that they offered those things in the tabernacle.
Yeah. But think of it. Here's another thing: because even though now we have a king, we have a united nation. The people still lived spread out through the entire land, and so there were still circumstances where someone was going to make an offering to the Lord, but they couldn't make it to the temple, and so they would stop where they were, build a makeshift altar, and then they would give their sacrifice. Let me finish on, because if my stomach is rumbling, everybody else's is as well. So verse 10, the speech pleased the Lord. Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, because you have asked this thing and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches, nor have asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall there any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that you shall not be anyone like him, or there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. And here now we get to the conditions. David didn't have conditions, Solomon does. So if you walk in my ways, and that's a present tense continuous, right? If you continue to walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Is he talking about the moral laws of the Mosaic covenant? Or is he talking about the requirements of the steward of the inheritance of the Lord? What do you think?
What's the stewardship? Because he said, as David did.
That's
David
right.
Wasn't always perfect in other ways.
That's right. That's exactly right. And why would God have to reiterate? No, I'm just making sure Solomon just followed the law of Moses. No, this is talking specifically about his role as the steward of the inheritance.
Because he's a steward.
Because he is the steward,
Ultimately
right?
the final king.
Yeah. Then Solomon awoke, and indeed it had been a dream, and he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Here we go, Judy.
Yeah.
Offering up burnt offerings, peace offerings, and made a feast for all of his servants. No mention that what he had done at Gibeon was wrong. Right? So we let God figure that out, right? So here's a question. I guess we're probably going to have to finish right here. Why do you think Solomon asked for wisdom and understanding? I've always wondered this myself. Like, here we have a young king, maybe 14. I mean, again, scholars like, how old was Solomon when he took the throne? Some suggest he was a teenager.
He had wealth already. He didn't need that.
Okay. But if you got wealth, don't you want more wealth? He had a kingdom. He had a city named after his father. We just read it in 1 Chronicles 22. David told him to ask for it. Go back to 1 Chronicles 22:11. First Chronicles 22:11. Now, my son, may the Lord be with you, and may you prosper and build the house of the Lord your God as he has said to you. Only may the Lord give you wisdom and understanding, and give you charge concerning Israel. Note this, that you may keep the law of the Lord your God. And again, he's not talking about the Mosaic law. He's talking about the requirements of the steward of the inheritance of the Lord. Remember context and history. Saul failed in this regard. That's why the kingdom was taken away from him. David succeeded. He transgressed the moral law, was punished severely with the lives of 4 of his children. Solomon knew that there was a direct link between the wisdom with which he executed the office of the steward of the inheritance and whether or not he would succeed like his father David or fail like Saul, his predecessor. Does that make sense to you? David told him. He said, listen, when you sit on the throne and you're governing the nation and you're acting as the steward, you need one thing. You need wisdom and understanding. And that's why when God showed up and said, ask me, what do you want? He remembered David's word. And he remembered his history lesson. And he says, grant me wisdom and understanding. And God said, great. You're going to have everything else too. He started out well but he didn't finish so good, did he? And that's going to lead us into our study of our next Mazzaroth sign, which is Aquarius, the story of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian captivity. Because as we all know, Solomon failed, and what happened after him was good king, bad king, good king, bad king, worst king, and so on. All right, any questions before we close and say blessing for food? Yeah.
I just find that last part kind of cool to figure out that if you're at all the time, Solomon was just wise, that he was really just being obedient to his father.
Yeah.
And now that has been put in play, it kind of shows like basically that was closer to the time when his father was around, where he asked for the wisdom. But as time has gone by, and he's further away from his dad and being obedient to his father, now he's kind of starting to do his own thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's cool.
Cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
Love God's word. I love these stories, man. Just love them. All right, Walter, will you say blessing for the food, please?